So, Dr. Fitzgerald, you've done a few studies in which you were able to reverse the biological age of the participants of the study. So, just for some context for anyone listening, there's biological age, there's chronological age. So, my chronological age is how old I actually am. I'm a 36-year-old woman. And there's biological age, which is how fast my body's aging, my organs, my tissues, my cells, which could change depending on a few things. So you were able to reverse the biological age of participants by 3.2 years in one study and then 4.6 years in the other study in just 8 weeks, which is crazy, fascinating. So what were some of the factors that you incorporated in the study that you think moved the needle in this remarkable way?
It's a great question. It was, that's the challenge of our intervention is that it's multifactorial. We're doing a bunch of different things at once and then studying what happens with regard to gene expression, which is where we measure biological age. So, and we can talk a little bit about what that is. But so we're looking at patterns of gene expression that are consistent with biological age and seeing, if at final our intervention moved the needle favorably. And so far, the answer is yes. Um, the cool thing about our approach and the unique piece about our approach is that everything is designed to kind of sweet talk gene expression. It's a program really, really designed to get in there and manipulate which genes are on and which genes are off. And of course, we want the best, healthiest pattern of genes on. And unique, I think, to other interventions is two things. One is the multimodal component. So the fact that we look not just at diet, but we looked at sleep, we looked at exercise, we had an exercise prescription, we had a meditation prescription, and we used two supplements that we'll talk about. So we looked at all of these things, everything specific to optimize gene expression. The nutrition pattern, so the diet that we prescribed is certainly probably really the most unique component in that every single forkful of food that an individual is eating is packed with what we call epinutrients. In fact, every single component of that forkful of food should include these nutrients. So it's just dense in these compounds that have evidence behind them for influencing gene expression. Let me stop there and just see if you have any questions around that, and then we can talk a little bit about those foods. And
Yeah, I think my follow-up question for anyone who's not familiar, what's so interesting about your work is that it lends evidence to the idea of epigenetics. So we're all born with the unique genetic blueprint. And I think a lot of people feel at the mercy of those genes. For example, I have genes that predispose me to inflammation or heart disease or breast cancer or digestive issues, but epigenetics kind of paints a different picture. And so what you're talking about here is that our genes can be influenced. So can you explain a little bit more, like what is epigenetics and why should we care and why does it matter?
sure, that's a really important foundational question. So that's a great question. It turns out our genes really aren't our destiny. So we may look at what's going on in our family and say, I'm going to get heart disease because my mom had it, my dad had it, my grandparents had it, etc. There might be a genetic bias there to an extent, but what we understand now is much more than our DNA, than what our genes, the variants that we might have gotten. It's the pattern of which genes are on and which genes are off. That's the big deal. And this pattern, influencing this pattern, we sit in the driver's seat of that car big time. Our daily choices over time really make an influence as to whether we're living our best life or not. And I want to say that back in the early 2000s, when the human genome was mapped out, when we identified all the genes in our DNA, we thought that we would have the Rosetta Stone. To your point, we would know, we would have a roadmap to what causes heart disease, to what causes diabetes, etc. But we didn't. And science pivoted. So we realized that it's incredibly more complex than one gene, one disease, or two genes, two diseases, two genes, one disease. So the gene disease pattern was really kind of blown up after we mapped the human genome. And that ushered in fully the era of epigenetics, above the genes, genetics. And really, again, studying what influences gene expression, what influences the biochemical marks that dictate genes being on or off. And that, really is up to us. So our genes are not our destiny. Maybe 10%, can have an influence in longevity. I mean, it's true that there are these pockets of people who have these gene biases and they live for a long time, even if they're like smoking every day and drinking lots. There are a handful of people. They're extremely rare. So there is, and there are some, actually a really good friend of mine recently had a heart transplant. In his family, there is a genetic cardiomyopathy very clearly, very strongly. And so he had a heart transplant. His sister has a heart transplant. He lost his mom at a very young age because of this genetic condition. He lost his brother. But that's the exception. It just isn't the rule, really. And, it's incredibly empowering, actually, that we get some choice here in living our best life or not.
And that is very empowering. And I know you mentioned earlier in the podcast how much food was such a core indicator to decreasing the chronological age in your studies, or sorry, biological age. You guys, I'm here learning just as much as everyone listening. So I'd love to hear, maybe what are some of the foods that kind of made that impact and really how diet plays such a big role in that?
Yeah. It's a great question. And I will flip bio age and chronological age too. So, and I've been doing this for a while. So like absolutely no worries. So yeah, we're talking about biological age because chronological age we can't change. So we're looking at this epigenetic process called DNA methylation. There's lots of different ways we influence genes on being on and off, but really one of the best researched and arguably one of the most important is something called DNA methylation. We don't necessarily need to understand the details other than lots of methylation happening on a gene will inhibit that gene, and few methylation. In the literature, they're actually denoted as red lollipops. So if you can imagine, just, visualize some DNA, a double-stranded double helix there, and these red lollipops dotting a region. Those red lollipops, those are DNA methyl groups, and they will inhibit that gene from being turned on. Conversely, if there's an absence of those red lollipops, or if we remove them, then that gene can be on. So it's all about where those red lollipops are, making sure they're in exactly where they need to be to make us the youngest, the healthiest, etc. So we need to make the red lollipops. We have to do that. That's something called the methylation cycle. That's the red lollipop machine. Nutrients that are really important for this to make these red lollipops include, actually, we were talking about seed cycling earlier, I think off before you hit record, pumpkin seeds, flax seeds, sunflower seeds, nuts, some animal protein. If you eat animal protein, all of them have an important compound called methionine. Actually, you can get methionine in non-animal based proteins as well. But methionine is an amino acid that's fundamental to the methylation cycle. We need B12 and folate, so we can get those from, anywhere from liver and greens and algae, on and on. Folate comes from greens. Mushrooms actually are a beautiful, robust source of folate. Other nutrients involved in making these red lollipops include eggs, if you consume eggs. Beets are fabulous. They're fabulous for something called betaine that helps to make them. So so we want to make the red lollipops, and the diet is dense in the nutrients to do that. But then the next really important thing is directing where those red lollipops go. All of these we call epinutrients because they influence epigenetics, they influence gene expression. But this second class of nutrients, these are the beautiful plant compounds that we know are so important and have been used throughout time. These have such long, beautiful use histories. I think one of the fundamental ways these compounds are extraordinary is that they help optimize gene expression. This includes green tea, used forever, curcumin and turmeric. Most herbs and spices are epinutrient wonderkins, rosemary, thyme, garlic, ginger, all of these colorful fruits and veg have loads of important compounds that can help. So thinking about berries, tomatoes, even citrus. In my book, Younger You, which is based on our research study, we have a 30-page epinutrient appendix. And for anybody who's a little bit anxious about starting a new dietary pattern and thinking it's going to be limited and restrictive, there are just so many epinutrient active compounds. So it really shouldn't be a heavy lift for us to be eating these all important compounds really at every meal, every day.
Yeah, absolutely. So was one study done on men and another women? Were they separate?
Yep.
Okay.
Yeah.
Were
So
there,
our first, yeah, go ahead.
I was just going to ask, were there differences in what was incorporated between the men and the women? And I guess my other question to follow up on that is just any information you can give us, age range, and then also was there any sort of calorie restriction?
The men, our first study was a randomized control study. So we hired a clinical research center actually at my alma mater at National University of Natural Medicine. We hired their Health Gut Research Institute there to run the randomized control study for us. And we recruited 44 healthy middle-aged men. We wanted people in both papers, we looked at middle-aged individuals. We want to look at the age. So we want aging to be happening. There's a predictable change to gene expression that happens. That's why we can measure biological age, because there's just this predictable change that happens over time. And we wanted to be able to look at that, kind of isolate that. So we did two things. We looked at healthy people, and they were middle-aged. So we weren't looking at, say, how diabetes shows up on the epigenome or inflammatory bowel disease or heart disease, et cetera. We recruited healthy individuals for our first study. Again, middle-aged men in the first one. And in the second one was a case series. It wasn't a controlled study. And these were the early adopters of our program. So once we finished our clinical trial and then I published the book about it, those people who were just really eager to jump in happened to be healthy and middle-aged, and by and large women. So our very first group that finished the program, from the beginning to the end, they did what we needed to do to actually have publishable, researchable, and reportable content, was this group of, actually there were 7. There was one man in the group, but he had to leave early, but I did mention him in the paper. So this was a group of 6 women, again, middle-aged, healthy. They're biohacker women. They're really, really healthy. Both groups at baseline had younger biological age than their chronological age. So they were just really clearly a healthy group, and we were able to get them younger still. The difference in what we did in the controlled study versus this group of women, there's a few of them. In our first study, we used saliva to measure biological age, but it turns out that blood is a better biomarker, or a better specimen. So we used blood in our second study, and that's what we use now, and we'll continue to use. We use blood as a specimen. Maybe one day saliva will be elevated and appropriate to use. It's obviously a lot easier to collect, but for the time being, blood is where we're at. We didn't have a control group, so somebody not doing it. We didn't include that, and we didn't keep these people from taking supplements. So we asked them to maintain their supplement protocol, whatever that was. So at baseline, they were taking supplements X, Y, and Z, and we didn't change it. And then they were continuing doing that. Whereas in our original group, we only allowed them to take vitamin D and a couple of other things. Otherwise, we didn't want them on supplements or medication. But in our second study, we didn't control for that. The technology, the clock changed a little bit. So while it's fun to say the women got almost 5 years younger, and the guys, a little over 3, and it's fun, and it's true. But
I love
the
it.
technology, I know it, yeah, the technology changed a little bit during that time. So it's not quite an apples to apples comparison, but certainly these women were really motivated, and just a great group for us to work with.
Yeah, and we talk about it all the time too on this podcast, that women are the drivers of all of this, right? We're the ones who are leading our families through getting
Yeah.
healthier. Like, we're going to rally the people. So it totally makes sense to me that this group of women coming in were the ones that were motivated. They were already taking on some of the principles that you practice. So super fascinating.
Yeah, it is. It's great. I mean, I think there's a lot of male energy in the biohacker space. And women, you're right. Women are badasses. I mean, they are the early adopters. They are the ones who've been adopting, using our book and making the recipes and turning their family onto it, and, buying the book for other people, and just, really kind of cutting the edge for us. So yeah, we do have a good group of biohacker women working with us, and I just I love it.
And the term biohacker always kind of makes me a little nervous. So as someone who is like in wellness and I am taking care of myself, I'm like, gosh, am I a biohacker? That seems like very intricate. But what I love about everything that you preach is like, let's focus on the fundamentals of, I'd love to hear, like, if you were to simplify any way for us to feel good, for women listening today who's like, Kara, I don't know if I'm a biohacker, but what can I do to implement today to kind of impact my own aging process?
Yeah, awesome. You're right. Like, we thought a little bit about maybe calling the book Biohacking for the Rest of Us. Like, what do the rest of us do? The
Yeah.
people who aren't sort of like tech billionaires, living a real rarefied world. Like, what do the rest of us do? And by the way, actually, Kaya, your question earlier was around whether we did caloric restriction in this. And we did a very modest intermittent structure. So 12-hour eating window, 12-hour fasting window, just super, super modest. We wanted our program, to your point, Yasmin, we wanted everyone to be able to do it. We didn't want to make it too hard or too aggressive with a narrow fasting window that, only a small percentage of people will be able to adhere to. We wanted our exercise prescription to be doable for anyone, even a couch potato who's just starting to move their body. We wanted everybody to be able to do it. So a small fasting window, and the nutrients are there. Again, there are things that all of us are eating regularly. Coffee, in fact, is an epinutrient. Some of the polyphenols in coffee are really healthy. If you happen to be a coffee drinker, you don't have to give it up. It is an anti-inflammatory diet. It's a low glycemic diet. It's a little bit keto leaning. We wanted people to get into what we call background ketosis, so they're making a little bit more. So it's not a ketogenic diet. It is not a ketogenic diet, but there's a little bit of background ketones being produced, and we know that those are epi compounds. They favorably regulate gene expression. They're great for brain health. So we wanted a little background of that. It's high in vegetables. There's some fruits. There aren't grains in the intensive. So we pulled grain out of the intensive, although after you finish that 8 weeks and you can do grain without an issue, you can bring it back in. The 8-week intensive also omits legumes and beans. I'm a huge fan of them. I just want to say that. But for some of us, we don't tolerate them as well. Either we'll get gas and bloating, or they might prompt a more significant glucose spike. So we just pulled them out for the 8 weeks, but they're awesome in protein, they're rich in fiber. There's so many reasons to be eating beans that we want people to bring them in after that 8 weeks. So vegetable dense, if you eat animal, there's some animal protein. If you eat eggs, we want you eating eggs. There's mushrooms. Mushrooms are superfoods in this diet. They're so important. So you should be anything from button to shiitake to maitake to some of the enoki, some of the more exotic mushrooms. If you can access those, you should definitely be bringing them in. And then, as I talked about earlier, curcumin, green tea, all of the herbs and spices. So those are some of the basic things we can be doing all the time.
Speaking of tech billionaires, it's seeming like more and more these days, longevity protocols are almost synonymous with supplements. I was watching Brian Johnson, and I think he takes like 50 supplements in the morning and then like another set in the afternoon. And I'm wondering, from your experience, if you think that we need supplements to achieve a long, healthy life.
I mean, we can look at the blue zone people who are living long and incredible now. Do they have supplement graveyards, as my friend Sarah Godfrey calls them? One time on Instagram, we did like a supplement graveyard. swap.
Oh yeah.
We just took our, yeah.
I love that.
Um, Isn't it funny? It's hysterical. Like, yeah, anybody who's sort of in this space probably has a supplement graveyard. Yeah, it's funny. We should do that post again. People who are living centenarians who are just living long, fabulous lives aren't taking closet full of supplements every day. It's just not a part of it because their life revolves around the things that support longevity. So eating this healthy whole foods diet, moving their bodies, staying in connection and community, getting sufficient sleep, like all of those things are just baked in. There is a place for supplements. So beyond what we used in our study, we used a simple probiotic and we used a greens powder just because I wanted more of those epinutrients. I just wanted to pack them in as much as I can. So just a greens powder and a probiotic in our study. But I do prescribe supplements routinely if you need help hitting these epinutrient targets that I think are so, so important. So for example, good quality mushroom products. If you're not eating maitake, enoki, etc., chaga, cordyceps, whatever, you can take a mushroom combination product. And I think I think the nutrients from mushrooms are important enough that, just grab a supplement that's a whole food. So it's not an isolated sort of synthesized component. It's a whole food. If you're not eating turmeric every day and not enough of turmeric every day, grab it. There's plenty of good turmeric products out there. So we can take those. I tend to prescribe epinutrients these days to shore up what I think might be limitations. Let me see. Beyond that, vitamin D. Most of us need extra vitamin D, whether we're getting sun or not, unfortunately. Most of us need a little extra fish oil. So there's some workhorse nutrients I'm sure that you guys are familiar with that, we're just deficient in, unfortunately, in this modern world. So those are my thoughts. I'm curious what he's taking. I'll have to look it up. It's probably one of his meals. It must be one of his meals, or maybe
I think, yeah, I think so.
Kara, you mentioned something in the past that really stuck out with me in one of your prior interviews where you said stress is inevitable, but managed poorly, stress will drive aging forward like gasoline poured on fire. I would love to talk more about this because if you have a great diet and you're doing all the things, but you still have stress, and we all have stress in our life, right? But it's like, how do we manage it? But I would love to kind of get your thoughts around all of that.
Yes. So stress, inappropriate stress, which I think, especially in the United States, in this modern world that we live in, it's an inevitability, and we really need to recognize it and sort of rally against it. We need to have built-in time to relieve our bodies of the sort of physiologic damage from stress. For me, I think a huge aha, and what you heard me talking about, was realizing that the biological age clock that we've used in both of our publications now includes measurements that are driven by cortisol, driven by the stress response. Like 25% of the biological clocks that we're doing are influenced by the stress response. There's no other variable to my knowledge that has as big of an influence on this particular clock. Like stress is such a huge component there. And I think it just hit home to me, the potential for that to be a huge driver of the age of accelerated aging. And, again, it's something that we can really make a difference in. Being in clinical practice, actually, here I am in my office where I see patients, it tends to be the last thing that people want to face. They're willing to come in and do all the labs. They'll change diet. They'll start exercising. They'll take the supplements that I prescribe them. But I live here in Fairfield County. A lot of people live here who commute into New York City. I mean, you can have a super stressful life living here. It's a long commute. Working in the city tends to be pretty stressful in and of itself. I mean, I've worked with a lot of women in my practice who are executives and moms. They're just juggling so much, and the stress conversation gets pushed away. So and I know this for myself, just being a mom and having my own business and all of that, like it can be hard for us to just bring it front and center. But I've seen it time and time again negatively influence people's healing journey. Like they have to just face that piece. In our program, we included a twice daily meditation practice. We wanted people to do at least 10 minutes of a very simple mindfulness protocol twice per day. We don't know, but that could have been, it could have been a really big variable. We'd have to tease out and study each variable separately, but that may have been more influential than our diet. Our diet's so creative and interesting and potent that, if somebody forced me to pick something, I lean towards the diet, but the stress component is huge. And we really, really focused on that in our program.
You're talking about stress. What are some of the other major drivers of rapid aging?
So poor quality diet. We're talking about what to eat. I've been defining that. We don't want to eat the standard American diet. It's toxic. It's so phenomenally pro-aging. And we can see extraordinarily new research coming out showing that we're dying younger. So mortality increased over many years, kind of with the era of modern medicine, antibiotics, et cetera. And so we hit, in the 70s, we could live to in the 70s, and we can talk about quality of life into the 70s because it's not great. But we've lost ground on that. So we're dying younger now. And it's not just COVID. That's obviously one of the pieces that have changed these statistics, but it's not. It's the quality of the diet. It's our lack of moving our bodies, in a consistent, solid way. Again, it's the stress piece, as I mentioned. It's toxins. Just the sort of the consistent assault of toxin exposure, be it in the air, in our outside environment, inside environment, be it on our foods, et cetera. So all of these variables come into play and we know can accelerate the aging journey.
Talking about movement, it's so fascinating. You also mentioned just a few minutes of physical activity can change over 9,800 molecules in our blood. And I was mind blown when I think I saw your Instagram post, because there will be days where I might not get some exercise in, but I'm feeling maybe a little bit overwhelmed because of meetings and everything going on. And I'll just take a quick walk down the street and up the street. And like the most simplest activity truly makes a difference. So I would love to hear, because you work with so many, high-powered women, and a lot of women listening kind of fall into that bucket. So how do you coach maybe your clients of someone who's saying, I might not have all the time in the world to like go into a gym and work out all the time, but what do you recommend, and why are these smaller steps still so impactful in our lives?
Yeah. And let me say, just in case I forget, I think one of the coolest pieces is that the older that we get, the more bang for a buck we get from exercise, especially where gene regulation goes. It's awesome. So we don't ever want to try to play the card, I'm too old to move, because that's absolutely not true. It's so not true. In fact, we will get more impactful benefit the older we are. We need to just be doing it all of the time anyway. I'll throw out another cool factoid. If you're preconception, if you're thinking about having kids at some point in your life, you will hand that information that your body has stored based on your exercise habits to your offspring. I like to joke you're going to like give your offspring a 6-pack abs or not, but it's not quite that true. But you will give like heart health, muscle, metabolic health, etc. That information that's been gathered from your own exercise habits, from dad and mom, will be handed off to offspring. So we can really set our kids up in a good way. If anybody's preconception out there, I just think it's so, so, so cool. So there's no time like the present to be moving our bodies. But yeah, to your point, what can we do? Right behind me where I wrote my book is a treadmill desk. I spend time on my treadmill desk every day. I don't spend my whole day on it. Right now I'm sitting. I'll do a couple hours. So when I'm in my office all day, I'll do a couple hours of meetings over there, and just standing and moving a little bit makes a massive difference. We have stairs here. So there's different kinds of meetings I need to do sitting versus standing. So if I'm in a lot of sitting meetings, sometimes that means I'm typing or having to do something that works better here. I'll get up and I'll just run down the stairs, go outside, take a big breath, and run back in. So just to your point, that it absolutely works. It absolutely counts.
Going to what you mentioned about preconception, it's kind of the phase that I'm in my life. And I will say during COVID and Kay and I started this business, I will say outside of me dialing in my diet and sleeping well, movement was one piece that I just did not focus on. And I've now brought it back in my life, especially after doing all these interviews with women like you, just knowing the importance of strength training, especially as we go older. And then I actually was working out yesterday and I was pushing myself, which again, I haven't done a great job doing. And I was thinking, gosh, is this going to impact me getting pregnant? Like, is it bad that I'm putting this stress on my body where it might not be helpful in this time frame that I'm in? But it looks like, to your point, it's still good to it's never too late. And if anything, it only benefits the future baby, I guess, that we might have.
Yeah, totally. Yep. I mean, once you're pregnant, you can continue depending on, I mean, you want to do to tolerance. You don't want to start like an intense CrossFit,
Yeah.
boot camp or something while you're 6 months pregnant. That's probably not a good idea to start it then. But if you're doing that, if that's already your thing, or, a friend of mine is almost due and she's still teaching her Zumba classes. So yeah, there's absolutely no reason to lay off the exercise. And yes, indeed, that information, that the epigenetic information that is happening when you're engaging in exercise and changing your gene expression in real time is handed off to your offspring. And I want to say that when we're in the habit, it's that continual engagement that will have the more impactful change. So it's important to just really get in there and come up with a reasonable habit that you can adhere to. But research also shows favorable changes just from one exercise. And the same is true with meditation. So we don't have to be, professional athletes, or we don't have to be the Buddha to gain benefit from, exercise or meditation. Just starting the conversation is information enough for our genes to respond to, which I just think is so cool, right? For somebody who's a non-exerciser, what we created in our research was pretty simple. Again, wanting people to be able to do it. Like my mom, for example, it's just 30 minutes, 5 days a week was the minimum. You could go up from that if you were inclined, but 30 minutes, 5 days a week, perceived exertion, 60 to 80% of your maximum. So if you're at 60% of your maximum, you might be sweating a little bit. But if you're walking, you can talk on the phone, or maybe you've got some friends with you. I mean, you can engage in dialogue. You might be breathing a little bit more intensely, but it's doable. So my mom likes to walk. She lives in New Haven here in Connecticut, and she'll do a few blocks, or she's gardening. I mean, that qualifies for her movement as long as she's 60 to 80% of her perceived exertion. So it should be something that you love to do, that you can commit to.
I love that. And speaking about, we were talking about preconception. I want to talk about the habits that we pass on to children, once they're born in this world. Yasmin texted me this morning and said, gosh, we talk so much about like stress management, and we talk so much about taking care of yourself younger. We talk a lot about preventative medicine. And this comes from our habits that we build when we're little. I have a daughter. I think you have a daughter, you mentioned.
I do. Yeah, I sure do.
How are you instilling this practice of like, hey, take care of yourself now, because it'll lead to major payoffs in the future?
Yeah, it's funny. It can be tricky. So funny. I mean, certain times I used to post photos of her on Instagram eating her broccoli rabe and salmon when she was really little. She was like the perfect eater. And, I would get like, little angry emoticons from my sister-in-law who couldn't get her kids to eat, if they would eat anything, she was happy. But then of course my kid became that, that if there's any lesson in humility, it's like, if you think your kid is, doing the right thing, eventually, they're going to throw that out the window. So now it's hard. She would rather eat sugar all day long if she could. But I think it's just how we live. So it's funny. Kids definitely keep you humble. But yeah, we're growing our own food. We're going out and picking it. I mean, she loves it. She just absolutely loves to be able to go out into the yard. She knows what edibles we have kicking around, and she can grab them. She's freaked out quite a few babysitters, but she'll, and then in our garden, she can, yeah, she's like, what are you eating? And she'll tell them. Movement is huge. I am athletic. I love exercise. It's kind of one of my grounding tools, and she's just taken that on with me. That's just become, part of her world. She understands the need for a healthy microbiome. We've talked a lot about the healthy oral microbiome. That's been a topic of conversation recently. And I think just when we live that, she understands meditation. Actually, this is awesome. And this came from outside of the home. I've done a little bit with her, but she's in a martial arts class where they always start with meditation. And I think it's so cool. It certainly wasn't a topic of conversation when I was a kid. Maybe when my mom started to practice insight meditation when I was a teenager, but we just didn't have the same awareness that we do now. So I think, that's what I'm bringing to her. And to your point, our environment does influence gene expression. So how we're living, what we're living, our engagement, our interaction, our connection, the maternal oxytocin, rush, all of this, and paternal as well, all of this influences gene expression, and it can be definitely associated with healthy, robust longevity. And I should say that the opposite is also true. So unfortunately, there's more research, not probably, there's more research looking at trauma and how that shapes the epigenome. So lack of physical contact in infancy. They've studied babies in orphanages who haven't gotten physical contact or stimulation. And we can see that is a negative age accelerant and can predispose to, the diseases of aging that we want to avoid. So early infancy, childhood can adverse childhood events, all of that can change gene expression and then influence us negatively. We can inherit our parents and grandparents, great grandparents, really a few generations out, we can inherit their experiences as well. This can be trauma. And that's been studied. We know people who were pregnant during and lived in New York during the World Trade Center bombings definitely offspring had epigenetic changes or have epigenetic changes that predispose them to more anxiety and certain kind of an inflammatory bias. And this has been looked at in different populations. There was an ice storm in Quebec that has been really studied, and women who were pregnant during this ice storm, physical or emotional, there was no difference between the stress. Physical stress had the same influence on gene expression as emotional. So if you thought that you were stressed, but maybe you didn't, maybe you still had power and heat or something, but you were still having the psychic experience of stress, that influenced genetics also. And their offspring had higher incidence of autism and asthma, interestingly enough. So probably a lot of us, if we look in our family history, and I talk about this in my book, and I actually reflect on my own family of origin coming from Poland, and there was probably some food scarcity, et cetera. So I can sort of track or speculate what I see being in my family an increased vulnerability to developing diabetes and heart disease, et cetera, probably something to do with the epigenetic changes of our ancestors. I guess a couple things. I think one, our good habits today are how we change that. I am not a diabetic. In fact, none of my siblings are diabetics. None of my siblings have, any evidence of heart disease, et cetera. So how we live, we have the chance to change that. I also think it's important that if we know our families come from some kind of a stress, that our stress threshold may be lower, meaning we may get stressed out a little bit more quickly. Just because we've inherited those patterns. And it's up to us to tend to that. So I think we can change those patterns. And the way that we change those patterns is by recognizing that's how I respond, and I'm not going to sort of push myself to be different. I'm going to honor this. I'm going to give myself a little bit more, downtime or nourishment or whatever we need to work on that I think over time we can change that and we can build resilience. That's I really have a lot of, I think that that is true. And hopefully in the course of research that I'll do over time, we'll be able to study these patterns of resilience and what drives them and how we nurture them, et cetera. It's such an interesting thing.
Super fascinating. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is information. So getting ready for your journey to motherhood, like that is information you're going to hand off, you and dad. I mean, it's really cool, and I think it can motivate us in a special way. But let me just stop. I want to hear what you both have to say.
I'm taking this another way. I know we're talking a lot about research and science, but I had an interesting experience working with an energy healer. I've never done it before. I was just curious, and it's not so much to listen to what they say, but I always think it's interesting about how you react to what they say, whether it's true or not. That's up for grabs. But she had mentioned a lot of the energy that's within me was ancestral. And she's like, did your mom move when she was younger, when she was 16, and flee a country? And she did.
Wow.
And listen, whether she feels it in my body or not, I was like, wow, I wonder if, I definitely feel like I probably run more anxious. I never realized this because I was never in tune with my body until now I'm older and, I'm off the birth control pill. I'm more healthier. So I've really connected that mind body connection in the most beautiful way. But I love what you said. Don't push yourself to be different, because so many times I'm sitting there and I'm like, why do I feel overwhelmed and stressed? Like everything is wonderful. I'm safe. Things are going well. And I think that's just me regulating. I don't know if nervous system is the right way. And that's my own journey to work through. But I just love, because so much of the time that we're in that situation, it's like, I catch myself thinking, why am I like this? And it's like, you know what? This is who I am. And I just have to work through it. And it's already getting better and better. So I just want to share that story in case it, inspiring to anyone listening. But I love how you said you can change it.
You can change it. You can build that resiliency. So certainly your mom's experience would have shifted, gene expression. I don't know how it couldn't. Likely some of that information was handed down to you. And yes, I think that, your good habits and you're intentionally cutting yourself a break, and really doing it over the long haul, because we can change. I mean, we know that we can change if we tend to become anxious. There are things that we can do so that we're, more resilient to the ravages of anxiety. I mean, anxiety can take us down or not, or we can work with it and really go stronger. So yeah, you're actively working on changing, I think, some of those patterns.
And it's so interesting too, because when Yasmin, you were talking, I was thinking that some of these things that we feel about ourselves, maybe feeling too sensitive or too anxious, are actually kind of superpowers, because it enables us to take better care of ourselves. Like we know that in this situation, I might have this sort of reaction, or in this environment, I might not like it. So we are the ones that kind of just actively take better care. So you were explaining about your mother. For my brother, Drew, who's also Yasmin's husband, when my mom went into labor with them, they were in Kenya and there was an attempted coup. And they didn't know if they were going to actually make it out of the situation. There were no doctors available. My father couldn't see my mother, didn't know if he was ever even going to be able to meet his son. It was a really traumatic situation for them. And my brother has always been so sensitive to inputs in his body. He has a sensitive microbiome. He can't smell certain, if he walks into a store and there's perfume, he's so sensitive. And I wonder all the time, like, is the trauma from his childbirth create this sort of sensitive environment in him? But I feel like because of that, it enabled him to go down his health journey and be able to help other people. So it's just kind of like a long-winded way of me saying that sometimes these things that feel like they're inhibiting us are actually like our superpowers, essentially.
Yeah, that's so fascinating. God, we all have these, these experiences. Yeah, it's extraordinary. I think we do inherit some of that information and those early experiences when our epigenome is sort of wide open, especially in utero, especially in the first trimester. That's a very, very impactful time. That's when that information is actively being laid down. Those lollipops that I talked about are being, shaped to, just make a human, to grow a human. In fact, let me just say, since we're talking about all of this, it's such an important time that in the book, I created a third diet. I mean, there's no PR around it, but it's called the Younger You Hybrid, and it's a pregnancy program. It's a preconception and pregnancy dietary pattern that I think is optimal, that is handing all of that epigenetic information, nourishing our, the growing baby and all of this information. And as I was writing the book, I was like, I'd be remiss if I didn't create a program for that incredibly epigenetically active time. And maybe I would love to get it out into the world. So I'm happy we're having such a lengthy conversation here. It's been all the attention has been on biological age reversal, understandably, but this is more impactful of a time, when we're laying that information down and building a human that's all about epigenetics. So yeah, I'm just, I'm thinking it'll have its moment in the sun, but
And we have to plug it because that's our audience. Like that's many of the women who follow us are women who are thinking about that.
That's so cool. So yeah, read the first couple chapters, and then the Younger You Hybrid, the pre-pregnancy and pregnancy diet, I think is chapter 10. You can just flip over to that, and there's you can use the same recipes. It's just the macronutrients are tweaked a little bit. We need more protein, etc. You need more calories in general. So things are redesigned a little for that time period, but you can use the same recipes. And the nutrient appendix, we just should be eating that information all of the time at every meal.
Earlier, you mentioned the healthy fats that you incorporated in Younger You, and you mentioned flax and pumpkin, which we're huge fans of.
You guys are huge fans of. That's so cool. That's cool that you're bringing seed cycling.
Yeah. I would love for you to talk about what about these fats in particular are so beneficial.
Well, it's the nutrients so not just the oil, so not just the isolated oil from it, it's just the nutrients found in these seeds are, just epinutrient wonderkins. They're important for making the red lollipops. They also direct where the red lollipops are being laid down, but primarily these seeds are big players in making the all important red lollipops. I mean, and this is like, just to give context around it, everybody knows when you're pregnant, you need to take extra folate, right? This is huge. It's a given. Everybody knows they need to be, maybe if they're doing a prenatal multi, there's always extra folate. We've got a mandated folate fortification program in this country. So any grain has to have folate. And you'll see that in a lot of plant milks as well. There's folate added. In fact, we can become folate toxic in this country if we're not careful. And I talk about this in the book, but folate is huge because it makes the red lollipops. It builds DNA and it makes these red lollipops. So if you think about it, anything that helps us make these all important methyl groups that regulate gene expression are massive. And so, these seeds are doing that. So they're just really, really essential to the growing baby. And they're essential really at any life stage. The older we get, interestingly enough, the aging process has very, very impactful changes to DNA to DNA methylation and gene expression. So that there's these very predictable changes to these red lollipops that sort of drive the aging journey in sort of the equal and opposite way that, pregnancy and early infancy, drive sort of growth and development. So all these fabulous things that we see in our babies or in our growing fetus when we're pregnant, all of these fabulous changes, they sort of equal and opposite. It's this negative trend when we hit middle age and beyond. So we want to be applying the same information at both times. We really, really want to be exercising our good habits, to sort of keep the changes from happening to our epigenome. Does that make sense?
No, it definitely does. And I know we're coming here on time, so I'd love to end on our last question here. I know we unpack so many things that we can do to reverse our aging and just have a better lifespan, health span. But if you could boil it down to maybe, let's say 3 things, if possible, that someone listening can take away from the interview today that you wish that they knew, what would it be? And what would those 3 things be to increase our health span and lifespan?
Okay, that's pretty easy. So any age, any point on the journey. So you're going to be a mom, you're a new mom, you got kids. or your middle age and beyond, we want to be eating epinutrients in every forkful. And we can do this. We can do this. This is within our reach. We want to be moving our bodies, and we want to be doing something to sort of nourish and de-stress. You know, if we can do those three things, you know, we're going the distance.
Super simple, but so powerful. Thank you so much, Dr. Fitzgerald, for joining
This was
us. And
fun. Yeah, it was great.
yeah,
It was great to be with you. It's a really interesting podcast, and I'm glad it was fun to be able to talk about this information that I don't tend to talk about as much. So good.
yeah, we love it. And we're so excited to share it with our community. So thank you again.